time to take a look at James. Has some controversy of its own. Martin Luther did not think it belonged in the Bible. He was very upset with it. He thought it contradicted Paul and salvation by faith alone. And maybe someday, if I get a chance and remember, I will do a hangout or hangouts on the so-called church fathers, such as Luther and Calvin and a lot of other things that went on in church history. But I did do some of that when I did a series of videos on little-known church history. So I don't know. We'll see. And then, of course, someday I need to talk about the illustrious King James, but this is not that James and this is not that day. So we're going to look at the New Testament letter of James. And I think I have the part of the outline up that I want to talk about later in chapter 2. So I'm just going to outline that and highlight that and go back and look at the outline. It's not real complicated, and this is not a complicated book. As I put in the description, it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, written letter of the New Testament, and probably before 50 AD, before the Jerusalem Council of Acts 15. And this is believed by most to be the James who was the half-brother of Jesus, and did not believe in him until after his resurrection. So this is someone, again, when it comes to qualifications for writing a New Testament letter, someone had to have known Jesus or is writing on behalf of someone who knew Jesus. And this is the case with James, of course. He grew up with him, although he wasn't a disciple until after, like I said, after the resurrection. He did grow up with him, and this evidently was enough for the other disciples to say, yeah, this is a legit writing about him, and it doesn't contradict anything else in the New Testament, although, like I said, Luther thought it did. So we'll look at that and see whether Luther was right. Luther also believes that several other parts of the New Testament didn't belong there. And so when it comes to people hiding things in the Bible, we have to remember that when it comes to any sort of official canon list, that this was mostly a later, even up to the medieval times, issue, and not something that the people of Bible times had a problem with. They knew the people who were writing the letters in the first century, and so they passed these letters around as authoritative teachings of the apostles. So later criteria really aren't as important as that, and as I've said before, presence of something in the canon or not was established well before any Roman authority came along. And I still see people in various places trying to say that the Council of Nicaea or Constantine had something to do with that. And the fact is the Council of Nicaea was only solely about a debate between Athanasius and Arius on the issue of whether Jesus was divine, and that Constantine only moderated the debate, and he wanted it settled so the bishops would stop squabbling and causing strife in his kingdom, his empire. So that's what that was all about, and people who parrot the other claim are simply uninformed, and they also seem to resent being told what the truth is about the Council of Nicaea and Constantine. There was no official canon until after Constantine's death, as I went over in the Babylon video a long time ago. So the issue is that right now in these book series, we're not as concerned about whether it should be there, but that it is, and we're going to see if it matches up with the rest of Scripture, and of course I think it does, and we'll find out why. So let's get into this. We have this rather sparse outline, and you know, for a 5-chapter book, I think it's 5 chapters, but there's some controversy in it. And as I said, when we get to chapter 2, I'm going to look at the issue of what is called lordship salvation. So let's get into the first chapter here. And the first thing he does, he calls himself a slave of God and Master Jesus United to the scattered 12 tribes. Scattered 12 tribes. So much for the lost 10 tribes theory. because here was James in the first century, in the first 50 years of the first century, saying that all 12 tribes were accounted for. You know, he's saying they're all scattered, but that none of them are lost. Nobody ever considers them lost. Paul does not speak of any lost tribes. And the Jews were persecuting him. So if anyone had a motivation to say something bad about, you know, Israel being dispersed forever and never to return, or any of the tribes being lost, certainly he would have said something. But both he and James speak of the 12 tribes and being alive and well, and so there's no reason for this lost tribe theory. There's all kinds of speculation, and yet the speculation almost always ignores certain uncomfortable facts of history if they do honest research. You know, and then people who do honest research typically don't leave things out on purpose because they don't like what they found. That wouldn't be honest. Anyway, James is writing to all 12 tribes in the first century, and he says, "Be overjoyed and consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you fall into various tests, knowing that the proving of your faith results in endurance. So let endurance perfect its work, so you may be complete and unimpaired, lacking nothing." So again, like Paul, he says, or Peter also, he says, don't be surprised that bad things happen to you as Christians. And he says, if you lack wisdom, ask God, who gives freely, and it will be given, but you must ask in faith without indecisiveness, or as the King James used to put it, double-mindedness. That's what double-minded means, or meant at that time. It means to be indecisive, sitting on the fence. So James is saying, God will give you wisdom if you ask for it, but you have to ask without this ambivalence, this indecisiveness. You have to be sure of what you want. You know, how can God give you something you don't even know what you want? And he says, the one who is indecisive is like the waves of the sea being driven and tossed by the wind. They should not think that they will get anything from the master, because such people are wavering and unstable in all their ways. And remember, this is a very non-theological letter, a very practical one, the very earliest one probably, before Paul came along and was given the developed theology of the church. Okay, this is very practical, very simple, very surface level, the whole book. Anyway, he says the lowly should celebrate their greatness, yet the rich should celebrate their lowliness, because being no more than garden flowers that quickly wilt. So he's saying, don't think highly of yourself because you're rich. Your life is as temporary as anybody else's, and don't think too less of yourself for being poor, because you're of great value in God's sight. And then he goes on to say, happy are those who endure trials, because it earns them the award of life promised to those who profess to love God. Is James saying you will be granted eternal life if you endure trials? Hardly, because not only would that be a contradiction, and this is what Luther thought, but the fact is that he's not even saying that here. He's saying award. You don't earn a gift. You don't earn a gift. And even he believed that when we get into the chapter 2 about Abraham and righteousness, that it is faith that saves people. So if James himself said that, then when he talks about the award of life, he's talking about something granted that was earned, and not something given and accepted that was a gift that was offered. So he's talking about an award of life. That is to say, you got through life without, and without neglecting the actions you need to do as a result of your faith. And we'll get into more of that later as well, as we have before. So he says, no one can say that these tests are from God, because God is not to be tested and does not test anyone. That is to say, testing in with the intention of making you fall down. What God does is allow things to happen to you that he himself does not cause, but uses them for good. As Paul wrote, all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So God will take the bad things the world dishes out to you and make something good come of it. Of course, you have a part in choosing whether you learn the lesson, but God allows these things to happen, yet make something good come of them is the key to all that. So James goes on to say, instead, each one is tested by their own desire, lured and dragged away. Desire, he's personifying now by the wording here. Desire conceives failures, and failures grow up to be death. Do not be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. So he is personifying. He's not saying that this was a literal entity that is born and grows up. He's talking about a sequence of things that happen when you allow desires of the flesh to go unchecked, because they give birth to something else. That is to say, they result in something else, which is sin, and then sin results in death. This is the sequence, and it begins in the human heart. Okay, it's because he says you're tested by your own desire. Then he goes on and he's writing, little snippets of things. Like I said, this is not a formal argument or a developed theology. He says, all good and complete gifts are from above, descending from the Father of lights, in whom there is no hint of variation or turning around. It is his intention to produce as bountiful first crop his creation by means of his word. You should all understand this, brothers and sisters. So he's saying the first crop of his creation by means of the word are the first people to believe. Okay, so really pretty simple and straightforward, I think. And then here's some good practical advice. Each person should be quick to listen, slow to speak, or become enraged, because a person's rage does not produce the justice of God. Therefore, put off all filthiness and malicious indulgence. Gently receive the word implanted in you that is able to save your souls. Become those who do what it says and not just hear it and only fool yourselves. For whoever hears the word and does not do it is like the one who sees their face in the mirror and then immediately forgets what they look like. But the one who looks intently into the law of freedom, and remains in it, who remembers what they heard and does it, will be happy. So he's a very practical, let's see your faith in action kind of a person. He says, if someone appears religious but does not control their tongue, they are fooling themselves, and their religion is a waste of time, which a lot of Christians today need to remember, to control your tongue. Okay? It's because he's saying, what good is your religious belief if it doesn't result in any kind of self-discipline? So he goes on, religion that is clean and pure before God the Father means, and he's defining what religion is, visiting the grieving and the widows in their distress and keeping yourself from being soiled by the world. Real simple and practical. So you go out and do things because you're saved. You don't do things to become saved. James isn't saying anything against Paul so far. And I should add also that although Luther didn't believe this book belonged in the Bible because of what it appears to teach about salvation by works, he also praised the large majority of the content of James as being good Christian living advice, which we've seen here in the first chapter. Okay, now let's get to chapter 2. Brothers and sisters, don't show favoritism. Honor the faith of our Master Jesus the Anointed. That's a solemn injunction, that phrase, honor the faith of our Master Jesus the Anointed, just as in the New Testament, when they put Jesus on that mock trial, the Jews did during the night, they said, give glory to God. That is what we might say in a court of law, you are under oath to tell the truth. You must speak, okay? So as James is using it here, there's no trial or legal talk involved, but he is saying a common expression of the time to show by your life how you honor God, okay? So that's what, we have to understand, that there are figures of speech that the people would use that we tend to take wrong because we don't know their figures of speech. So anyway, he's saying, don't show favoritism. That's what he's putting this stamp of approval on by saying honor Jesus, honor the faith of Jesus. He's saying don't show favoritism. And we do that as soon as we create a clergy class. And also when we put someone above someone else on the basis of their flesh, we're saying that is showing favoritism, and James says don't do that. He says if someone comes to your meeting wearing fine jewelry and fancy clothes, and another comes in filthy rags, you tell the rich one to take a seat of honor and the poor one to stand in the back like a slave. That's showing favoritism. He says, did you not discriminate among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, doesn't God choose the poor of the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom promised to those who love him? Yet you insult the poor. Aren't the rich the ones who harass you and drag you into court? Are they not the ones who speak disrespectfully against the ideal name you bear? The best thing to do is to fulfill the royal law according to the writing, love others as yourself. So he's saying, you know, think about what you're doing when you fawn over the rich or the famous or the powerful or the influential or the popular. When you fawn over them and give them special honor, you are showing favoritism, and in doing so, you are insulting the poorest people, which are the ones most likely to come to faith and be loyal and be decent Christians. You know, and so he's saying by showing this favoritism, this cultural norm, that you're actually disrespecting the poor for whom Jesus died. He said, goes on in verse 9, if you play favorites, you're failing, sinning, and are exposed by the law as criminals. Because anyone who keeps the whole law but trips over just one thing is guilty of law breaking nonetheless. The one who said, do not commit adultery, also said, don't commit murder. So if you don't commit adultery but do commit murder, you have still broken the law. So speak and act as those who are about to be judged by the law of freedom. As again, he's saying the law of freedom. And he's talking very early on in the first century, while Judaism still had a temple, about people who, you know, he's talking to Jews, the 12 scattered tribes, as it said at the beginning, that saying that, you know, think about the fact that you can't keep the law, as Paul said also. So he's in accord with Paul there. And think about the fact that if you're a lawbreaker, no matter which law you break. And he says here in verse 13, for the judge will show no mercy to those who don't show mercy. Mercy trumps judgment. I think I skipped verse 12. So speak and act as those who are about to be judged by the law of freedom. No, I did read that. Law of freedom is what he's talking about as Christians then. And he's saying, take an example from the old law. And that is that, you know, you can't just keep part of it. So he's saying, don't play favorites. Don't just be nice Christians to people who can pay you back, okay? So he's again being very practical and down to earth in this very early letter, and not, you know, being super theological or anything. He's just saying, look, if you're a Christian, let's see you act like one, not as judging your salvation, but as saying you should question your own salvation, not that others should question it for you. And I think that's the key to what was confusing Luther and what confuses a lot of people today in what's called, as I mentioned, lordship salvation. And he says, mercy trumps judgment. That is to say, and here again, this is in accord with both Paul and Jesus, the judge will show no mercy to those who don't show mercy, because Jesus said the measure you use to judge others will be used to judge you. So if you're merciful to other people, which is not to say you forgive people who haven't repented, I think that's a very big mistake and enables sin and encourages it. But what they are saying, all of them, is that when somebody repents, as Jesus said in Luke, if they come back and say, I repent, forgive them, that this is showing mercy. That's where you show mercy, when you give someone forgiveness who is sorry about what they did. And so he, you know, James here is in accord with all the others, saying that this same measure will be used to judge you, and that it's better to show mercy, because God then will show mercy to you on Judgment Day. And then he gets into the part that people get backwards. He says, brothers and sisters, what do you gain when you say you have faith but never act on it? That is not a faith that saves. Now, let me read the whole paragraph, actually the 2 paragraphs, and finish the chapter. Suppose a brother or sister is lacking food and clothing. You just send them away with, well, I hope you get some food and clothes. What good is that? In the same way, faith that is never put into action is dead because it is alone. Now, someone may say, you have faith and I have actions, but without actions, how will anyone know you have faith? So you believe in one God. Fine, but so do the demons, who do not only believe, but shake with fear. Are you demanding, empty-headed one, to know, and he said that, why this invisible faith is useless? Look at our ancestor Abraham. Wasn't he shown to be just when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You can see that his faith and actions worked together, and the actions completed the faith. And that fulfilled the writing. Abraham believed God, so he was credited with righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. So you can see that a person is shown to be righteous from works and not only from faith. Likewise, with the prostitute Rahab, was she not shown to be righteous by her actions when she sheltered the army scouts and then sent them out by another route, talking again about the Israelites coming up to Jericho and having to, you know, send out scouts to check out the place before they thought about attacking. And just as James says, just as the body is dead when separated from the spirit, so also faith is dead when separated from actions. Now we need to go back and unpack those last two paragraphs. And this is where I highlighted this part of my outline on James. As the popular phrase goes, faith without works is alone, but faith that works is never alone. This gets into Lordship salvation teaching, so-called. You can look that up. Those who say this demand proof by works that a person has faith, or they call them unbelievers. But that's something only God can know. It is not anyone else's place to judge whether these people are saved or not. We can only see actions, and there are times that actions force us to expel someone from our fellowship, 1 Corinthians 5, but we dare not call them lost without asking first what they believe. Again, James is imploring people to put their faith into practice, not writing a thesis on salvation. And those who insist on works for salvation cannot agree where the line is drawn. Exactly what and how many works are required? And where does the Bible say this at all? You know, where does it say you must have at least this minimal amount and kind of works in order to show that you're saved? That's the problem with Lordship salvation, or salvation by works, is what works and how many. Nobody knows, because the Bible doesn't teach that. Instead, we see the same line of reasoning Paul used about the difference between spiritual infants and mature adults, between the spiritual immature and true disciples. A dead person exists but is useless. Likewise, a dead faith exists but is useless. We are not to be content with just being born, but to be useful to God and other believers. That's the gist of what I think I would take James' writing, I would interpret it as such, because this is, again, why Luther, I don't think, realized this, because, as I said, he liked the bulk of James' letter, but felt that he was teaching salvation by works, but he's not. He's saying, what good in the world is a faith that has no actions? It doesn't result in anything. It's dead as far as the world or anybody else can see, because it doesn't do anything. I mean, you know, it's like a stillborn baby. Even though the baby exists, it's not growing, it's not moving. There's something seriously wrong. Now, again, it's up to God to say whether the soul has ever been saved or not. But what James is saying, just like anybody else in the New Testament is saying, that there are certain inevitable results of faith that should be there. And if they aren't there, then you individually need to look within and say whether you have that faith, because there's something wrong with it if you're not acting on it. People, we have the expression, actions speak louder than words. And I see this all the time, such as when people will say, we tolerate any idea except yours. You know, they say tolerance, and they say peace, and they say unity, and yet when it comes down to it, they're, to certain ideologies, especially in the political realm, it seems, they're suddenly not tolerant, not peaceful, and not interested in unity. For example, when the so-called political left will talk about tolerance and knowing, believing that everyone is equal and fairness and all this, and yet these same people will gladly and boldly and proudly disparage, mock, even physically attack political conservatives. So this shows by their actions that their words are hollow and hypocritical. And in the same way, we see on the Hangouts all the time, where people talk about being unified and accepting all opinions, but oftentimes, and most of the time, anyone who it's okay to attack certain ideas, and marginalize certain people. And when those people finally put up a defense, then all of a sudden it's a problem. Then they're causing discord by arguing. And people say, well, just leave them alone, while you sit there and allow them to pummel you like a punching bag and walk on you like a doormat. And they don't want you to lift a hand in your defense. And so the problem is not lifting a hand in our defense as Christians. The problem is the double standard, the hypocrisy of the world, which says we accept everyone, but we're allowed to attack you, and you're not allowed to say anything in your defense. And that's where I have the problem. The problem is not religion, it's not politics, it's double standards. And James is talking about that double standard when he says, you say you have faith, your words, but your actions say something quite different. And that's all he's really saying here. He's not saying that you have to save yourself by doing things, because otherwise he'd have to say exactly what things you must do and how often you must do them and to whom and when and where, etc. If something's a requirement for salvation, I expect it to be spelled out in the Bible. So since we don't have any list of required works or their duration or kind or frequency, then James is not teaching salvation by works. Okay, what is he teaching? He's saying there's something seriously wrong that you need to deal with yourself if nobody can tell that you have this faith. No one can tell. That's the issue. He's talking about what the rest of the world can see, including the Christian community. If they don't see any results of your faith, you need to seriously ask yourself whether you have it, because it's normal to act on what you believe. What people do shows what they believe. This is just a general principle of mankind. If people will talk with their feet, so to speak. The fact that I've said many times before, I don't see a lot of Christians in the Hangouts standing up for the faith when the faith is being trashed, because they see what happens when a few of us stand up and they say, well, you get called bad Christians if you stand up, or you are told that you should just ignore those people who are attacking you, and they don't want to stand up. But then their faith is invisible. James is saying, actions speak louder than words. So if you have this faith, act on it. And don't be afraid of what may happen as a result. And so he's saying also in very practical terms here that Christians should be at the forefront of helping the poor. Actually helping them, not just saying, I'll pray for you. Okay, sometimes that is all you can do because you can't physically help them. But when you can, you should. And that's all he's saying. And he's saying, look at Abraham for why invisible faith is useless, because no one else can see it. It may be there well enough inside of you, but what good is it to anyone but you if no one else can see it? And he says, look at Abraham. It's what he did that showed he had faith, not that earned him the righteousness that God said he had. Okay, and then once again about Isaac being offered on the altar, he was not actually killed. And as Hebrews explained, even if he had to go through that, Abraham believed God would raise him back to life again. So this was not a blood sacrifice. It was not a human sacrifice. No sacrifice happened at all except the animal, the ram that was caught in the thicket nearby. And this, again, was a type and shadow of what Jesus would have to do to redeem mankind from the kingdom of Satan. So it all does fit together when you think about it. And so what James is saying is nothing different. He says that you can see that his faith and actions worked together, and the actions completed the faith or perfected. That's the range of meaning of the Greek word. It does not mean that the faith was not really finished or not existent. You either have faith or you don't. And Jesus said faith the size of a mustard seed, a tiny, tiny dot, is enough faith to move mountains. That is to say, there is no degree of faith for salvation. There are degrees of faith for other things that I think at least Paul and some of the others, I think perhaps talked about the fact that your faith can increase and that God grants certain people an extraordinary faith. But salvation faith is either there or it's not. And what James is saying here is that we could see he voted with his feet, so to speak. He put his money where his mouth is, all the other expressions, that by his actions, Abraham showed everybody else what his faith was instead of keeping it to himself. And he says that fulfilled the writing. Abraham believed God, so he was credited with righteousness. So here is James saying point blank that salvation is by faith alone, but that actions naturally should follow faith. Okay? And he was called the friend of God, which is an interesting statement. So he says you can see a person is shown to be righteous from works and not only faith. Shown to be. Okay, actions speak louder than words. And that's the thing that James is getting at that I think Luther and some other people have missed. Okay, so now let's go on to chapter 3. And then we'll take a look at the chat because this is such a short book. Don't be eager to be teachers, sisters and brothers, because we who teach will be judged according to a higher standard. How many times have we seen popular authors or preachers put on a pedestal and have all of their many grievous sins brushed away with the excuse that they get away with it because of their high standing? That's the opposite of what the Bible teaches, and James is no exception in saying that if you are in a position of influence in the body of Christ, you are held to a higher standard. Okay? He says, we all trip up a lot, but if you don't trip up in your words, you are mature and self-controlled. And here's controlling the tongue again. We put bridles on horses to make them go where we lead, and we control huge ships with a tiny rudder operating according to the will of the one at the helm. In the same way, the tongue is small and proud, but look at what a huge fire it can start. And a fire it is, a world of injustice. The tongue is situated to lead the whole body and ignite it all, and is itself ignited by the eternal fire. He's saying, watch your tongue. As he said before, earlier, control your tongue. Evidently it was a big problem in those days, and still is now, where especially people claiming to have faith need to show it by controlling their tongue. He says, but though people have tamed everything in nature, the wild animals and birds and reptiles and even sea creatures, no one can tame the tongue. It is an evil, poisonous fang. We use it to bless the master and father, yet also to curse people who are made in the likeness of God. And here's one of those statements where we have unbelievers who are being called made in the likeness of God, because there are some who teach that only believers are made in God's image, and especially only men are made in God's image. But it says people here. It's not gender specific in the Greek, and James is talking about these people being unbelievers who are made in the image or likeness of God. But of course, the context, the point is, although it's an interesting statement we need to pay attention to, the point is that you can't have a forked tongue. You can't sing praises to God with one side of your mouth and then curses to others made in God's image out of the other side of your mouth. Out of the same mouth, he says, come both blessing and cursing. Things don't have to be this way, sisters and brothers. Can both sweet and bitter water come from the same well? My sisters and brothers, fig trees cannot produce olives, vines cannot produce figs, and salt water cannot produce fresh water. So he's saying about inconsistency here, about the double standard, about being holy in one hand and evil in the other. So again, very practical. And he says, and commonsensical, which of course isn't common anymore, is anyone among you wise and knowledgeable? Then they should demonstrate it with good behavior and gentle wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and factions and bragging, you deny the truth. This is again in line with what Paul said to the Corinthians. That sort of quote unquote wisdom comes not from above, but from the earth, the soul, the demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and factions, there is also upheaval and every foul practice. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure, then peaceable, moderate, reasonable, full of compassion and good results, unbiased, and does not use a double standard. Those who plant peace will pick the fruit of justice. So that's, I think, the description of the entire chapter and maybe the entire letter is double standards. People who don't walk the walk. People who say one thing, do another, or who bless God and curse people he made, and who say they have faith but don't act on it. That's all the same theme in the whole letter so far, at least, and especially in chapters 2 and 3. This is what James is all about, getting rid of that double standard and acting like your faith is real. Okay, and he's not teaching salvation by works. He's just saying, how can people who have faith not act on it in some way? All right, chapter 4. Where do battles and fights among you come from, if not from the cravings clashing among you? You want but cannot have. You murder and are jealous, but it doesn't get you anywhere. You fight and battle, but gain nothing because you do not ask. And even when you do ask, you do not receive because you ask with the bad intention of squandering it all on self-gratification. He uses this phrase, you unfaithful spouses. Don't you realize that to be friends with the world is to be enemies of God? I've said this many times before about Christian compromise with those who are hostile to the faith. To be friends with the world is to be enemies of God. Whoever wants to be a friend of the world is considered an enemy of God. Or do you think the writing scripture says this for nothing? The spirit that lives in us, within us, wants us for itself. This is where we get the idea of jealousy. And here again, to explain the difference between jealousy and envy. Jealousy is keeping a close guard on what belongs to you and making sure no one else gets it, while envy is wanting what does not belong to you. And so that if you see the word jealousy in a translation, that it's talking about the good kind, and that the Spirit, the Holy Spirit in us, wants us for itself. That is to say, keeps a jealous guard on us. And then he says, yet he grants favor all the more, which is why he says God sets up for battle against the proud, but is favorable to the humble. We've seen that phrase before, that your attitude toward God is going to have a big effect on how he treats you. And if you're proud and daring God to do things, he's going to be your enemy. So he's saying in this whole paragraph then that the reason we have all this strife is because what comes from within us is a desire to have that which does not belong to us and is not some right that we can demand. And he's saying, make a clear break with the world. You have to be in it and spread the gospel and be salt and light, but don't align with it when it's hostile to the faith. Instead, he says, align with God. Stand against the accuser and he will run from you. So you have to stand up. You cannot make Satan run away from you in fear if you're being a chameleon and not speaking up when your faith is attacked. Not you personally necessarily, but your faith. That is to say, Jesus, the Bible, etc. He says, come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you errant ones, and make up your minds, you who can't decide. Be miserable and mourn and cry. Change your laughter into mourning and your joy into sorrow. Humble yourselves before the Master and he will lift you up. Don't cut each other down, brothers and sisters, because those who do that despise the law and judge it. And if you judge the law, you are putting yourself in the place of a judge. And what law is he talking about? The law of freedom, as he said. But there is only one lawgiver and judge, the one who can either save or destroy you. Who are you to judge others? So this is talking about infighting among Christians who are cutting each other down. And this happens over and over again. It's happened, all my life. It's happened to a lot of other people as well. Our biggest enemies are the people who were supposed to be in the same army, so to speak. That you have to watch your back as much as the enemy coming towards you, because your fellow soldiers don't know who the enemy is. They think it's you because you stand up, because you draw your weapon and you put up your shield when you're attacked, and they think this is bad, so they attack you and tell you to stop wielding your sword when the enemy's, bearing down on you, and all they can think about is what's wrong with their fellow soldiers. And that's the message that James is trying to put across here. He's saying who are you to judge your other believers here, saying that you're cutting each other's down. You're judging someone else's servant, as Paul said. And he says, then one other practical thing, today or tomorrow we're going to go to the city for a year and conduct profitable business. He says, you have no idea what will happen tomorrow. Your life is a vapor that vanishes as soon as it appears. So instead you should say, if the master approves, we will live or do this and that, or as a popular phrase in English at least, God willing. But right now he says you are boasting and showing off, and that is wicked. So if you know what's best but don't do it, you fail. This is where and of course the word fail is one of the words for sin. And so he's saying it's a sin to not only do bad things, but also to fail to do good things. So if you know what's best but don't do it, that's a sin. And here again, actions speak louder than words. This is the common theme of James, where he's saying, if you have faith, act on it. And so if you fail to act, then you're committing sin. So this is the same message said in just another way. And then finally, the last chapter here. As for you rich people, cry and howl because of the misery coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your money has corroded. It will testify against you and eat away at your flesh because you hoarded wealth in the last days. There's the reason. It's not just being rich. That would contradict the rest of Scripture, but he says hoarding money and withholding it from those who deserve it. And he's saying, listen, the wages you withheld from your employees are shouting out, and the distress calls of the workers have reached the ears of the master of armies. You live in decadent luxury on the earth, fattening your hearts for slaughter. You convict the innocent and murder those who aren't even opposing you. So it isn't all rich people James is talking to. He's talking about the ones who hoard money and use their wealth to oppress people who were innocent and not even causing them any harm. So he says, then going on to a next topic, be patient, sisters and brothers, until the master is here. Observe, the farmer waits for the priceless produce of the land, patiently waiting for the early and late rains. So you be patient too, and be ready, because the master is almost here. This is another instance of the principle called imminence, where we don't know when Jesus is coming back. Do not mutter against each other, so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. My brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the master as examples of suffering evil and enduring it. Happy are those who endure. And this is not endurance for salvation. Okay? He's saying that you're putting up with evil done to you and not sinning as a result, and trying to take your own vengeance. Happy are those who endure. You heard about the endurance of Job, and you understood how it ended, because the master is filled with great compassion. Above all, my sisters and brothers, do not take oaths, not by heaven, nor by earth, nor by anything else. Just say yes or no and mean it, so you won't come under judgment. There was a big problem, especially Jesus addressed this as well, with the Pharisees in his day, where they would nitpick over what you were taking an oath by, whether or not you could legally weasel out of it later if you wanted to. They made those rules for themselves. And he's saying, don't take any oaths at all. If you take an oath, it means that you are not really, it's not really a conviction. It's something you're just making a show of. I think it's more of that kind of a context. At any rate, he's saying, don't do this, because it kind of is a bad witness. I get the impression that he's saying here. Just mean what you say. You shouldn't need an oath to bind yourself. You should be as good as your word. So when you say you're going to do something as a Christian, you should do it. You shouldn't say that because I didn't take an oath, I'm off the hook. You should, if you tell somebody you're going to be somewhere on a certain time, or you're going to do some work for them and you don't do it, that's a very, very bad witness. And you will come under judgment for, not keeping your word. And then he goes on to another topic. If anyone among you is suffering, they should pray. If anyone is happy, they should play music. If anyone is weak, they should call on the elders of the congregation and have them pray over them, putting olive oil on them in the name of the master. And the word means olive oil. And I don't think there's any hard and fast rule in Scripture about not only anointing people with oil, but with the particular kind. But that's just the kind of oil that was used for anointing. Okay, so that's why, but I'm just, translating what's there. And he's saying that, Christians, instead of first running to the doctor, you might want to consider getting other Christians to pray for you first. Just a suggestion here from James. And he says, the claim made in faith will save the weak, and the master will raise them up. And if they have failed or sinned, they will be forgiven. So if somebody, in particular, he seems to be talking about someone whose illness or weakness has come as a result of having lived in sin, and that if this person repents and in front of the church and they pray for him, that sin will be forgiven. He says, admit your failures to each other, your sins, and stand up for each other. This is not what is being done in Christianity. We don't stand up for each other, so that you may be healed. The persistent request of the just is very effective. Elijah was a person just like us, and when he prayed for it not to rain, it didn't rain for 3.5 years. He prayed again, and the rains came over the land to make things grow. And interesting for 3.5 years, because as I mentioned before in one of my recent Hangouts, I believe for various reasons that the two witnesses of Revelation will be Enoch and Elijah. I talked about Enoch before, especially I think when I went over was it Jude or something, I think Jude or Hebrews. The other person being Elijah, who was also taken to heaven alive. And this 3.5 years is the duration of the preaching or witnessing of the two witnesses. 3.5 years. So I think there's a connection. I at least have something to go on in the Scriptures. So anyway, he parts with this paragraph, my brothers and sisters, if anyone among you is led astray from the truth and someone turns them back, understand that the one who turns them away from deception will save their soul from death and cover up innumerable failures. So there's something to be said for, as another phrase puts it elsewhere, being snatched from the fire. We have to have compassion on the lost and not just condemn them. We have to we're here for a reason to reach them. Now, we do have to take a stand against the hostile, but not everyone is hostile. Some people are simply just not realize they're parroting what they've heard, and they haven't really studied it, and we have to be careful that we're not turning away souls who might be open to the gospel. And here again, if we need something practical and consistent to look for, it is whether there's hostility or not, open hostility. And so we have to be discerning and understand the people we're talking to, and whether they're just mistaken and stating opinions, or whether they're actively opposing the Christian faith. Okay, and that's when we need to stand up. I don't know, a lot of times people don't notice what I'm trying to do in a chat, but I will ignore a lot of people who are, I know those people that they're just trying to pick a fight, and I ignore them. But when somebody says something that is especially grievous falsehood about Christianity, such as that the Romans wrote the Bible or the Jesuits wrote it, who weren't even invented till 1540, and such other things such as Jesus never existed, it's our duty as Christians to stand up and counter that. If we don't stand up, as James has been saying, what good are we? We have to have actions to show our faith, not to save ourselves, but because we are here for a reason, and people need to see us walk the walk. Okay, and that's what I think the whole book of James is about, aside from specific instances, as I'm going through in the outline here, about other issues that he was addressing. There's a consistent theme, and that is walk the walk. It is to say, don't have a double standard and don't be a chameleon. You must stand up when it's time to stand up as a Christian. And this is something that Christians must do. Okay. Now I think I'm done with James pretty much, and it was fairly short. It hasn't even been an hour. But I do want to wait till next time to go over the 3 letters of John. Second and third letters are each only 1 chapter, and I think First John has 5 or 6 chapters. So we should be able to do that easily in one hangout. Then after that, I will start on Acts. That will take quite a while. And then last of all, the Gospels, which I will do synoptically, which is to say, treat them all as 4 accounts of the same thing, which they are, and try to put those all together. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen, so what's going on in the chat. Yeah, the 3.5 years is an interesting thing that here again, we have types and shadows in the Old Testament that tie things together if you're looking for them, and you have to actually be reading the Bible to look, which a lot of Bible critics don't do. They don't read it themselves, or they don't spend much time studying it. But the point is that you find these little nuggets here and there if you're looking, and that 3.5 years just jumps off the page at you when you've read about prophecy and the 2 witnesses and Daniel 9 and the 7-year period of tribulation being split in 2 halves of 3.5, and that the 2 witnesses are killed at the 7th trumpet, and yet they had been busy, active for 3.5 years before that. So their activities begin at the beginning of the tribulation. That's when we see the 2 witnesses. And that, I believe, as I've said for various reasons, that these will be Enoch and Elijah, the only 2 in the Old Testament who went off the earth without dying, and that this 3.5 years is a tie-in to Elijah, at least. And now some say the other one will be Moses to represent the law and the prophets to Israel, which is a decent argument too. But there is something to be said for Enoch being taken alive out of this world because of being righteous. And he would be an a witness to the pre-flood world. So it's hard to say. And I'm not going to be, start a fight over who the 2 witnesses are. I think that's silly, but it's just an interesting thing about the 3.5 years for sure. Yeah. Oh, the thing about Buddha. The other day in a chat, there was someone making provocatory statements against Christians, and nobody said a word. They could provoke all day long, and the Christians are supposed to be chameleons and never say a word. But when someone says Jesus never existed, and I counter with Buddha never existed, I'm not just trying to provoke them. I'm trying to show them a double standard, like I've been talking about here with James all morning. The double standard is the problem. That's the double standard. When somebody says Jesus didn't exist and I say Buddha didn't exist, that's simply a counter move on the chessboard saying, okay, do you like it when I say Buddha didn't exist? Is that okay? Can I say that? And I can't, apparently, because only the Christian who uses the same kind of argument to show a point is that only that Christian is said to be bad, and not the person who did the provocation and made a claim that is false, demonstrably false. Not even unbelievers who of any scholarship believe that Jesus didn't exist. They know he did. Even Wikipedia says Jesus existed. So when somebody says something that ignorant among people who claim to be awake and aware, then for them to say that Jesus didn't existed, I'm not going to just spoon feed them the answer and say, here's the proof that Jesus existed. I'm going to say, Buddha didn't exist. That's good teaching. That's what a good teacher would do. Okay? And as far as holding me to a higher standard, and I just read that in James about teachers being held to a higher standard, that is not low. That's good teaching. When you show someone by example something that they're doing, you're holding a mirror up to them and saying, this is what you're doing to me. This is how you get a teaching into a student's head. It's not exterior application. This is getting it inside of them and saying, do you understand that this is what you're doing to me in making a false claim that Jesus didn't exist? And that in no way is provocatory. It's simply getting their attention to say, look at the double standard you're using to the people who only attack me instead of the other person who started the thing. And I'm just holding the mirror up to them. That's all I'm doing. And that is not evil. It's not bad teaching. It's not a lower standard. And here again, Christians need to stand up, and it's not for non-Christians to tell us when we're bad or good. They don't know. And they don't understand what I'm doing and what my tactics are in the game. Okay? There is no guarantee that they won't understand, or I wouldn't try. Jesus wouldn't tell us, and the Bible wouldn't tell us to go out and be salt and light if we weren't allowed to say anything, and that if they had no possibility of understanding it. That's the whole point of witnessing, is because people can understand it. Okay, so here again, I'm not going to be lectured on my standards by people who aren't even part of the faith and don't understand what I'm doing, what I'm trying to accomplish. I've seen other people who are not Christians get badly misunderstood because I know what their tactics are. I know the person well enough to know that they have a reason for saying what they're doing or talking to whom they're talking. That it isn't what it appears on the surface by other people who don't know them. In the same way, people don't know me and they don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and they presume my motives, just like I've been accused of pre-crime and condemned on the basis of what I might do by people who don't know me and don't know what my motives are and presume to judge me on the basis of what they don't know about me. Okay? So anyway, this is a Christian chat, and Christians will judge our own behavior, and we will use the Bible as our standard. And if you look at the videos I did on what would Jesus do, what would Jesus not do, and what about Paul calling people stupid, wishing curses on certain people, telling the Judaizers that they should go ahead and emasculate themselves since they wanted to push circumcision. Those are very crude things, and by any same standard, they would be considered bad teachers. Okay? So if I'm a bad teacher, I would ask people who make this charge against me to compare what I do to anything close to what the Apostle Paul did or Jesus did and say that I've done something sinful or bad or a lower standard. That's just not possible. So as far as pre-crime, I'm just using examples. I didn't name any names. Okay? Yes, you did apologize for that, and that's very good, and I accepted it. But I'm using it as an example. I didn't say you were still guilty as charged. I said, this is what people do to me. But you brought up, again, you did the same thing to me. So you're repeating, even though you repented of the first thing, you're doing it again. You did it again last night in that chat about the thing with Buddha, when this person had been attacking and saying Christians that Jesus never existed. And that when I say Buddha never existed, that was to get them to see the double standard, and you didn't understand why I was doing it. And I've done nothing sinful. You're charging me with sin against a standard you don't even have. You don't know the Bible. And I've said, look at what Jesus did. Look at what Paul did. Those are my standards. Those are my standards. But if you want to judge me, then I don't know why you're here, because I'm not going to your chat anymore because you keep doing these things to me. You know, you're saying I have bad behavior. Well, based upon what? Your personal opinions? That's not what I judge my behavior on. That's what nobody should judge my behavior on. It's if you're judging me as a Christian, you got to go to the Bible and look at what the Bible says. And here I'm saying, you know, and I would consider what you're doing offensive and provocative. And you should, you know, why don't you practice what you preach, Arwen? Why don't you ignore me when I say things that you don't like? You told me to ignore the other person in chat, and the best thing to do would be ignore them, but you don't ignore me when I'm saying things you don't like. So if I'm following your example, Arwen, about how to behave when someone says something you don't like, you're not doing that. You're calling me to account and you're getting in my face about it. Okay? I'm direct too, and that's what you don't like about me. So here it is again, where there's a habit I'm seeing of someone judging me on a standard that they themselves don't meet. Here you are in the chat taking me to task for things I said that you don't like, while telling me I can't do that to others. This is a double standard that I see on your part. Okay? And this is why I leave you alone. I don't go to your chat and harass you about it. You should have left me alone. If that would have been the example in that chat last night. Okay? You tell me to ignore the person who's attacking me, and yet you don't ignore me when I'm saying things that you don't like. I don't understand the double standard there. Okay? And I wasn't attacking the channel owners. I wasn't attacking Patricia. I wasn't attacking anyone on the panel. I was having a conversation with another person in chat and not attacking you. Why did you step in at all? It wasn't your business. I was talking to another person, and I was trying to show them to hold up a mirror to a false claim. That's all I did. So anyway, this is a Christian channel, and what Patricia lets go on in her chat is her business. You know, she herself is a nice person. She doesn't attack Christians. But what goes on in her chat is that everybody turns a blind eye when Christians are attacked. Okay? And how you took it, Arwen, is probably not how most other people took it. And I don't accept your explanation because you don't accept my own testimony of what my motives were. So anyway, yeah, there is a double standard that I see on your part, Arwen, and that's the reason that we clash all the time, is because you say I should ignore the guy in chat, the Buddhist in chat, but you don't ignore me. So anyway, I've pretty much had enough about that. I mean, you're coming to my channel attacking me. I haven't done that to Patricia. So this is a double standard. Okay? This is a double standard, Arwen. You understand what I'm saying? You're saying one thing and doing another. You're telling me to ignore people who say things that are provocative, but you don't ignore me when you think I'm saying something provocative. And you come to my channel to attack me for it. I didn't go to Patricia's channel and attack her. And you're saying that's what I did. That's a false accusation and a double standard on your part. This is a good illustration of what James has been talking about with double standards. Okay, and I explained to you why I respond the way I do. I can't help that you don't accept it. That doesn't mean I'm a bad Christian. It doesn't mean I'm not meeting the standards of a teacher, and I never claimed to be one. All I'm doing is running a YouTube channel. I have 7 people watching right now. You know, what kind of a teacher am I? So you're way out of line saying that I'm supposed to be this teacher to the higher standard. I'm meeting a higher standard than just about everybody else I've met online. And it's never good enough. And that's what I'm sick of, Arwen. I'm sick of your judgmentalism too. So I think I've about had it with you. Okay? I'm going to time you out at least. Next time it's a ban. Because you're causing discord. You're doing what you say I am not allowed to do. And I've had it with that double standard. But at least it serves as a good example of the topic today. You know, saying one thing and doing another. Okay? Because here again, you know, I'm in a chat talking to a person who says something provocative, has been saying it and saying it, saying it. And then I finally stand up and say, hey, look, Buddha never existed. That wasn't mean. It wasn't provocative. It was holding up a mirror to the same thing that had been done to me repeatedly, to all Christians. And who gets attacked for it? Not the person who's been bringing the provocations, but me who's held up the mirror. So, you know, by someone who says I should have left that person alone and ignored them, who doesn't ignore me, that's a double standard. There's no other way to say it. It's a double standard. So anyway, I'm not putting up with that in my chat anymore. If Patricia doesn't want to put up with things in her chat, if she wanted to have a double standard, that's her business because it's her channel. Context is everything. You're absolutely right, Chow, because that's why James is misunderstood. They don't understand what he's getting at. If you read the whole letter and look carefully at the words, especially in Greek, and not let the translation get between you and what James was actually saying, then you can see, you know, even as bad as some of the translations are, that they are saying something quite different than most people think they're saying. Okay? But the point, once again, to try to tie up James here is, not to tie him up literally, context, is to summarize James, is all about double standards, about people who say they are Christians and have faith but never act on it, and what a bad situation that is, and not to use that as a way to bludgeon other Christians and judge their behavior, but to say to each of us individually to be our own worst judges, to say to ourselves, why is it that nobody can tell I'm a Christian? Okay, this is what I've been talking about for I don't know how long now, about Christians being chameleons in these chat rooms and just standing idly by while people say, like I've mentioned so many times before, like, for example, Jesus never existed. This is demonstrably false. He absolutely did exist. And even secular, largely anti-Christian Wikipedia, if neutral at best, will say that Jesus existed. There's almost, as they put it, almost universal agreement that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist and sentenced to death by Pilate. These are historical facts that are as established as any other. So when somebody says Jesus never existed, that's a falsehood that we Christians need to stand up and speak out against, because not only is it against Christian faith, it's against the facts as anyone can establish them, and it's spreading disinformation. So here again, it's the issue of when a Christian is supposed to stand up. I mean, we have to be salt and light, and get along with people as the best we can. But the constant theme through all these New Testament letters has been that you show mercy to the humble, as James just put it here, what God does to us, showing mercy to the humble, and set up for opposition against those who are opposing, you know, actively against the faith and attacking it. So it's not, you know, I don't have a problem with people not accepting the faith. I don't have a problem with people who just disagree. What I have a problem with is when they attack mine or spread disinformation about it, then I'm going to speak up. And I don't think by any rational standard that I've spoken up in a way that is way out of line to the way anybody else would speak up. I mean, that's why I tongue-in-cheek called myself bad Christian for such a long time, because no matter what I did, no matter how high I raised the bar, it was never high enough for some people, who Christians and non-Christians alike, who thought I wasn't meeting the standard. And I'm like, you know what? If I look at the Bible and if I look at other Christians, I don't see objectively what standard I'm failing to meet. But here again, with James, it is all about having the same standard for everyone, as far as not, you know, what a double standard is, which is where you say, I'm allowed to get away with murder, but you're not. That's a double standard. what is not a double standard when you're saying that a teacher should be held to a higher one. That's not a double standard, it's a higher one, and they're not the same thing, just to clarify. So here again, we've seen some interesting things in James as well about the 12 tribes, as it said at the very first sentence of the letter, that James is writing to the 12 scattered tribes. So if you missed the first part of the Hangout, that would be an interesting thing to go back and look at about 12 tribes. And the fact that anyone who claims to be a Christian needs to walk the walk, and that we should not show favoritism and all that that implies, and that when it comes to our behavior as Christians, we need to raise that bar. And here again, we are to be our own worst judges, and the Bible is our standard, and not, especially not people outside the faith who think they know that they have a place to judge who's a good and a bad Christian any more than I would go around judging who's a good and a bad Buddhist or who's a good and a bad Muslim. I don't go around doing that. I don't go around looking for people I know say are Muslims and going, hey, you violated the Quran just now. Even though I've read the Quran, I don't consider myself an expert on it. And I don't, go around telling Muslims they're not doing the right thing as Muslims. But there seems to be a lot of people who want to tell Christians they're doing the wrong thing and not being good Christians, and that we don't know our own Bible as well as they do. And I find those claims extremely arrogant and divisive and provocative. But, a lot of people don't agree with my assessment of those things. But here again, I largely stick in my own channel. I don't, attack people on the panels anymore as I've done that in the past. We all have our moments. But here again, my objections have been restricted mostly to when people are spreading disinformation or disinfo about the Bible or facts of history that are demonstrable even by non-Christians, such as Jesus existing, and the fact that the Jesuits could not have written it since they didn't exist till 1540. And the Bible, we have fragments from 150 AD or 125, something like that. Fragments of the Gospel of John from that early, the 2nd century. So that's, we're all going to draw the line at a different place as far as our personal convictions on when we as Christians need to speak up. But what James is saying is that as Christians, we got to stand somewhere. We can't just be silent as the grave as Christians and keep our faith to ourselves. That's not, a faith, as he said, that's a dead, useless faith. Even if it exists within us, if we don't express it, what good is it? If we don't walk the walk, what good is it? What practical use is it to the world or to other Christians? So anyway, that's all James is saying, and I don't see, if you study him carefully, why, for example, Luther would have such a problem with him. He's not teaching salvation by works. And it's a very practical, no-nonsense, everyday life kind of letter on Christians walking the walk. It's really all it is. And some practical advice too. So I think that's, like I said, that's pretty much all I have to say about James, and we will go on to the letters of John next time. He had, and this is not the Gospel of John, this will be his personal letters. There's some interesting stuff there. Then after that, we'll get into Acts, which is the transitional period, the early history of the church, and then the Gospels. And of course, those things will take quite a while to go through. But anyway, that's enough. It's been an hour, and my ever-shrinking audience, like I said, with the illustration of the boy rescuing turtles at the beach, it matters to one or two. And that's enough for me, I guess. So I see I have a downvote again already. Got one yesterday. I don't know. At least it means people are watching. I mean, every vote is a vote, right? So, but, the Bible isn't popular. It's not meant to be a feel-good story. And it's just, it's the way truth is. Truth divides. It unites and divides. It'll unite those who seek truth, and it'll divide from people who don't like the truth when they hear it. And it's a double-edged sword, so to speak, as the Bible would put it sometimes. And so, yeah, this is not about popularity. It's about how bad do you want the truth, even if people hate you for finding it. And that's an interesting thing, too, just to bring up. I think I've talked about that before, that people want to seek truth but not find it, because a lot of people, when they say, and they're probably not aware of this, when people say nobody should ever say they know it all, I agree with that. But when they say nobody should say they found the truth, I don't agree with that, because that's saying you're allowed to seek truth, but you're not allowed to find it. What if you do find truth? Are you not allowed to say I found the truth? I mean, it's just your opinion, right? As long as you don't say it's the truth everyone must believe, I don't see the problem with anyone saying I found the truth. I mean, what's the point of looking for it if you're not allowed to find it? So as Christians, yes, we say we have the truth. Jesus said, I am the truth. There's nothing wrong with saying so and saying this is our conviction. So anyway, see y'all later, whoever decides to come back, and we will look at the letters of John probably Monday. Take care, everybody. Thanks for coming.